And we're back, and it's COMP392 Advanced Graphics here at Centennial College in the winter 2016 semester, and it's week 2, lesson 2, part 4 of our broadcast. So last video we made was a couple things. We talked about assignment number 1, which is due February 5th. That's a couple weeks out, right? And a bit. And we also talked about some technologies to get you guys up online, going through DreamSpark to get Microsoft Azure, or choosing Heroku as a deployment target, as well as creating a GitHub repository and using something like a cloud service like Cloud9, and by the way, there's others out there that'll do the same thing, and deploying directly to Azure, right, by creating a, not this one, by creating a, going to the Microsoft portal here for portal.azure.com and setting up a continuous deployment. That's what you're doing here, a continuous deployment. And notice now that I have 2 deployments, one, the initial one, which is down here, and then plus this updated GitHub. So a continuous deployment target, so that way whenever I change on GitHub or I update my project, it automatically deploys to the site. And notice here how this is my simple site that I made. This is an index.html, that we're deploying. So from now on in, I'm going to try as much as I can to do all those 3 steps, but I'm going to do it with Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to start off with Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. I'm going to deploy to GitHub. I'm going to create a target, some kind of web app online. You're going to see it a bunch of times. And then I'm going to auto deploy to the web, right? And then that'll be my testing ground. I can test locally. First, I'll test locally and make sure it's all working locally so I don't waste my time. And then when I'm sure it's working, I'll deploy remotely and it should work the exact same way, right? And I want to do that over and over again from now on so that way you guys see it so you're prepared. It prepares you for what it's going to be like on your assignment 1. Remember, your assignment 1 is going to prep you and assign you for your exam, your midterm, where you will have to deploy live, right? So if you haven't done this and you're waiting until the last minute to do this live deployment stuff, it'll just be that much more difficult for you to do, all right? So please get into it because cloud service, deploying to cloud service and deploying to Git, that's why I paid you for that free lab, 2%. Using Git and GitHub and all that kind of stuff is critical for us as developers these days, all right? And to be the most modern web developers, okay? So please, I would ask you, if you don't know how to do it, there's lots of tutorials online, free tutorials that teach you how to do that stuff. And it's something that you can do on your own. Of course, you can also watch the videos, and they might help you, right? But for sometimes you watch a video and you're like, I still can't do it, right? And so what do you do? Well, remember, I do have office hours, and they're by appointment. So you can always send me a quick note and say, hey, Tom, I need to do, and we forgot to meet during the break, but I need to do office hours with you. Can you set up a time, an hour, half an hour? What's your time? What's your availability this week? And I'll meet with you face to face. Or I don't know, we'll do a hangout session with you and 3 of your best friends. I don't know. We'll do whatever you want, right? But we can do a short session where I can try and clear up some of your issues, right? Okay. So that's Azure. Let's try, loading up one of the examples I have up online. Remember, I have a bunch of examples. And last day we left off with example 1, and I showed you kind of example 5, right? From COMP392 lesson 1. And I'm back to lesson 1 because I want to cover things very thoroughly when we do 3JS, right? So if you haven't had 3JS, if you haven't had a chance to read ahead, you can certainly do that. Now remember, the book that I'm using is available through Pact Publishing, right? And it's called Learning 3JS, and it's a 2nd edition for 2015. So you can certainly download that. There's a few issues with the book, and one of the things that I want to mention off the top is some of the examples they give in the book may or may not work with the latest version of 3JS, right? So if it doesn't work for you, you probably haven't done something wrong. It just means that 3JS has updated and there's something that can't work. And I will talk about that as we get closer to doing that. So let's look at, I'm going to look at lesson 1, part 2, right? So we kind of did part 1, which is what was a wireframe last time. I'm going to look at part 2. I remember how we did it. We just went to this lesson, and I can download, for those people who don't remember how to do that, I can download the zip file. From here, what I'm also going to have to do, this zip file, is I'm going to have to load up, I'm going to have to do a Bower install locally. And I'm also going to have to do a TSD install if you want to have your TSD, your TypeScript file, have code hinting, because otherwise it won't load in your typings folder. Notice how there's no typings folder up here, right? Notice no typings, and there's no lib folder, your lib file. So what happens? One person asked me, well, how can Microsoft interpret what's going to happen here? So why don't we do a test? I'm going to load this GitHub repository directly onto Microsoft without making any changes, and let's try this out. So here's my GitHub repository, and I'm going to go over here to my deployments. I'm going to click on the plus for Microsoft Azure, so just to show you another time how we can do this. And let's see what happens with this. What do we need to do? And sometimes you might have a little bit of problems, and I want to talk about these problems with you. So web plus mobile, and I'm going to set up another web app, right? And my subscription is pay-as-you-go, but your subscription should be Azure Pass. That's what you should see, okay? Azure Pass. Mine's not Azure Pass. Okay, so now I need to make a name for this website, and I'm going to call it the same name as my GitHub. So I'm going to say COMP392, and we're going to say lesson, just to be clear, lesson 202-part 2, kind of thing. And if that's not right, and it's not lesson 2 part 2, it's lesson 1 part 2, by the way. Lesson 1 part 2. Let's just check it to make sure it's the same. I don't have to do that. I want to do it because I want, so that way I can add other things up there for you guys too, right? This is the name of the file, and it has to be unique across all Azure websites. So if your buddy, if your friend makes a name for a site, you can't use it. Only one person can have that name, okay? And now again, from a resource group perspective, the default here is defaulting to East US. You can also choose other resource groups if you want to have other performance, like for example, if you're in the West, or even if you're in Europe, you can add other deployment targets. And the same thing goes for my plan and or location. I can add a new plan and a location here by choosing other options here. I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave it as is and click Create. When I create, it creates. What it really does here is it's creating a container, just to go over this again, a container where my apps will live, okay? My web app cannot live, I can't deploy to it unless it's created first. The first step I have to have is basically a GitHub account, right? Second step, I have to have a repository on GitHub. After I have a repository, I have to create a container, a web app container from a repository. As long as I'm not running Node.js, if my application is not a Node application, once it's done, it's going to take me to my folder, and I can auto-deploy. Node.js requires a couple of extra steps to make that run if you're running a Node application, all right, with Azure. So notice, I'm done deploying. The deployment succeeded. It takes me here, right? Now this site is blank. It doesn't have anything on it. It's just a container, right? And I want to do the same thing. I want to scroll down to where it says Publishing, and I want to click on Continuous Deployment. And by the way, you might have to set up your deployment credentials for the first time. You can certainly do that. I'm going to choose OK. If there's anything for me to configure, notice that there is. I want to choose GitHub. Under GitHub, it's going to ask me what organization. I'm going to choose Centennial College. You may only have one. I have 3 GitHub organizations. One, which is me, and there's 2, one for the other college and one for this college, right? And then I'm going to choose my project, right? And under Centennial, I'm choosing lesson 1, which I told you I would. If I scroll down, lesson 1, part 2. This is right here. Right here it is. So I've chosen a target, and now it's asking me for what branch, because each GitHub repository can have multiple branches, like a primary branch and others if I want to. And we're not going to talk about branches right now, but that's another option for Git repositories. Then I'm going to leave it at master and press OK. When I do that, it's going to deploy. It's going to attempt to deploy my application to the web. So now it's successfully set it up. Give it a moment or so in order for it to do it, because if there's a problem, right, it's going to show up afterwards. I'm going to scroll to the left, and I'm going to choose my my location here, my new site. I'm just going to click onto it, create a new site, and if everything went well, I should have my lesson 1, part 1 deployed. Now there's a problem, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about. So we're clear, right? So let's refresh and see what happens. Okay, so now let's take a look and see what I get in my inspector. Notice how in my console I get a few errors. It says, well, I don't know what stats is. I don't know what dat.gui is. I don't know what 3.min.js is. I don't know any of this stuff. Why? Because in my ignore file, in my git ignore file, I have not included that stuff on GitHub, right? And Microsoft, in this particular deployment, does not recognize 3JS, does not recognize that stuff. So how do I fix it? And we're going to talk about that, right? I would obviously not exclude it from my git ignore file. I would include it in my git ignore file. So how do I do that? So go back to, let's fix this thing. Now I know that in Visual Studio Code, I have a version of this thing locally that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go into my courses. I'm going to go to 392 as an example, and I'm going to hit this lesson 1 as an example to fix it, right? Remember, it's auto deployment. It's this continuous deployment. So when I make a change, I upload it to GitHub, and as long as it works locally, it's going to deploy automatically to Azure. I don't have to do this step again, right? Okay, so cool. So I want to grab my code archive, which is COMP392 lesson 1 part 2, this one, and drop it into Visual Studio Code to fix it. Let's do that. Okay, cool. So there's Visual Studio Code, and notice how I have my lib folder. I have all this stuff. I have my typings and everything, and I also have this git ignore file that I've been using. Well, all I need to do to fix this problem is get rid of this lib. I can get rid of this from the git ignore file. And if I want my typings to be up there too, like all my type definition libraries, I can get rid of the 2 of them, scripts lib and typings, like this. The other ones I can leave there, it's not going to hurt me. Okay, cool. Now that I've done that, I have 75 changes, notice, on my stuff, because those are 75 files I have to upload. That's why we leave them out. But we're doing continuous deployment here. So it's okay for you guys to do this. I'm okay with it. For Heroku, by the way, Heroku is smarter than Azure in that it'll be okay with your Bower, right? But because we're using Bower and we were attempting to hide the locations, even with a Bower.json file, Microsoft Azure does not detect it. So we have to fix it, all right? So the files that you see online, you have to do a TSD install and a Bower install. Anyway, here, once I fix this file, this lesson 1 part 2, you won't have to fix it anymore. You can download it and it'll run right away. And that's what Microsoft wants you to do. Microsoft wants you to fix it, right? A deployment target. Okay, let's fix it. So I'm going to go into my Git and notice that there's a bunch of changes. I can click individual items to add to my staging area, or if I hover over my changes, I go to the plus and it adds all of them, like this, right? All of them. Even my git ignore file, notice my git ignore file changed. There's 74 changes. I want to add them all. I want to make sure all of them is added, not just the git ignore file, all of them, right? And now I'm going to say updated project to run on Azure, right? Because that's what it needs, right? And I'm going to click this checkbox, check mark. The check mark stages all my changes. Now they're not pushed to GitHub, right? They're not pushed. I can, once I've connected to GitHub the first time with Visual Studio Code, right? I can go here to the ellipses and push. And once I push it, it'll do its thing and it'll push those 75 changes to GitHub. Once the changes are done, once it's done deploying, like it looks like it is now, if I give it a second, if I go back here, right? Here's my Azure. If I did everything correctly and if I refresh, then we should theoretically see the changes come up online. I'm still refreshing, right? Notice how it's waiting for Azure to get those changes. And sometimes the deployment takes a second. Like, take a look, it's still cycling. So give it a second, you know, before it happens. And by the way, to check the deployment target to see if it's done, you can always go to deployments and see what's happening. See, it says updated project to run on Azure. But meanwhile, this project, the actual project here, is still cycling. That's okay. And sometimes what you need to do is close it off because it's a live site and just open it up in a new window, right? Sometimes it's all you need to do. Sometimes, regardless of what you do, it won't run, right? So we'll just wait for it to give it a second because it's still charging up. And it takes a few minutes to charge up. So I'll let this go. But that's the way it's typically done. You run it up, you load it up. Here's something else we haven't done. We haven't tried to run this locally, this little thing. I've just automatically deployed it live, right? Thinking that it's going to work just fine. Let's try it locally and see if there's a problem, because that might alleviate some of this pressure right here. Okay, let's try it out. So I'm going to go up on back to here. Oh, let's see what problems I got. Oh no, it's not ready yet. It's getting there. Okay, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And I want to see this. I want to reveal this in Finder, right? So here's my Finder. Here's my project. And I want to double click this index.html. And let's see what I get. Well, this is what you should get, right? This is the final version of it. of lesson 1, part 2. One thing to note here is this is the axis helper, right? What's the green axis typically? What does that mean? Y, right? So what orientation does 3JS have relative to Blender? Blender is Z up, and 3JS is Y up, just like Unity, and just like other objects up there, right? Notice that it's taking its sweet time to deploy. Don't worry about it, okay? Don't worry at all. And we'll kind of do some smaller examples here, because it can't give you an error unless, I mean, it's still trying to access. This is not me having a problem. If I had an error, I can go to inspect, and it would give me my error in my console. I'm not getting an error in my console, right? I'm not getting an error in my console because it's still running, still trying to get to Azure. So give it a few minutes, because I've just redeployed. Sometimes also what really helps is if I copy this code right here, because I've deployed it one time, and put it inside incognito mode, because sometimes that helps. If I go new incognito window, because it doesn't cache, and just paste and go in Microsoft Azure, and then it'll pull up the thing. So there it is. There it is on Azure, right? Because see, it was cached, and it didn't know what to do, right? So incognito mode solved my problem. It actually deployed nicely on Azure. Take a look, right? So if you go try it out, try going to this now for you. See if you understand what I'm saying. Go to comp392-lesson01-part2.azurewebsites.net and see if it deploys for you. You should be able to see it online now. If you can't see it, then I have a problem, right? Because somehow Microsoft is down. There's a zombie apocalypse out there, right? And we're all killing each other with tire irons, right? Okay, I don't know. I'm joking. But you know what I'm saying? It has to be up. If I'm up, you're up, right? Unless there's a problem with the school site. You're good? Yeah. So this is what I want you to do. When you auto-deploy, right, sometimes you have to take away the stuff from your gitignore file to fix the problem, because your gitignore file tells GitHub to ignore certain types of files and not load them up on GitHub. I'm loading everything up on GitHub this way, and it's less efficient. It's not optimal for us, because in a real you have to download and install everything, right? But here we're deploying live in a production environment to Azure. So sometimes we have to make sure that they have our library files, okay? Well, let's take a look at this code to see what I've done here, because we're really talking about 3JS. We haven't really looked at it today, right? So when I go into my scripts, I've organized everything into a couple things, library and objects. And for now, for this version of our code, this lesson 1, part 2, notice how in my TypeScript, I have, again, a long laundry list of variables, right? I use the import statement for TypeScript to pull a reference or create an alias for scene. Instead of typing 3 scene, I'm just typing scene. That's what this is doing, right? And down here, these are my global variables in my global namespace. And all I'm doing here is declaring them. So I'm saying here's a cube geometry, and I'm using the cube geometry, which I've used as an alias up here. So cube geometry is a variable for my cube that's appearing on my screen that is of type cube geometry, 3 cube. That's what it is. Remember, I need 2 things to create a mesh. What are the 2 things that I need to create a mesh in as an object in 3JS? 2 things I need. I need a what? I need a geometry and material. Those 2 things. Geometry and material. I'm going to ask you about this. I'm going to ask you the same question next week. I'm also going to ask you next week about GitHub continuous deployment, because we talked about today, right? If I say what is continuous deployment, you should know the general idea of what it is. You don't have to be very specific. I'm not going to ask you to do a continuous deployment next week on your test, but I may ask you about it. I may ask you about continuous deployment. So please study it, try it out a couple times, fail a couple times. It's okay to fail, because you know what? Your assignments due a couple weeks out. So figure out your problems. Try a bunch of little deployments on Azure as an example, so you can do it effectively, right? I'm also going to ask you a little bit about Cloud9, because we talked about Cloud9 today. So what is Cloud9? It's a software as a service. It's an IDE on the cloud. That's what it is. As long as you know that, you're good. You're golden. You understand what it is, right? Those kind of things is what I'm going to ask you. So this is in the global namespace. And as I come down, remember what I need to do here in my, as long as I've loaded everything up in my index.html, notice my index.html binds everything together, right? Binds everything together. I can't deploy my application without calling up or including my script files, my library files. So that's the first piece. And also, I need this onload in this version of my code. I am not using an IFI. What's an IFI? A what? Self-executed anonymous function, or, right? What's the other word for it? What's IFI stand for? The actual word, the IIFE. What's IIFE or IFE stand for? Immediately invoked function expression. All right, immediately invoked function expression, an IFE. That's what it is. So I'm not using an IFE here, but what I'm doing is I'm saying I'm using this onLoad attribute, which is like an event handler, to say when my body loads this piece, then call my init function. And where is my init function? It's inside my game.js. So, or game.ts. Here's my init function right here. So this init function contains all this code that it's gonna execute, right? So it executes my scene. It executes my setup renderer method, which is down here. I set it up down here. Here's my setup renderer method, which does a bunch of different things here. It sets up my render. It sets up my background color, my size. It tells me that my shadow maps are enabled and so on. And it even sends a little note to the console that says, hey, I'm running. And then it sets up my camera the same way. And it tells the camera, it's a perspective camera. Hey, here's 3 marks for you for assignment 1, perspective camera right here, right? And it tells me the X, Y, and Z positions and what scene to look at and everything, right? And on the top here, notice how first we set up our renderer and then we set up our camera. Here's my access helper. So if you just follow this example, you've got the marks for access helper as well. That's what I'm asking you to do. Set up an access helper by following the example. In fact, if anything, if you follow the examples, you're going to be able to do your assignment 1 pretty straightforward, okay? So I've got my plane geometry. Hey, there's your ground plane that I asked you to make, right? So that's part of your marks right there, your ground plane, right? Hold on a second. Sorry, just a little bit. I had to talk over it. It was pretty loud. All right, so here's my ground plane. And remember, every time I add an object to my scene, I need to use the scene.add. Scene.add is like saying, take my object and add it into my scene. Make it a child of my scene. So my scene is my container, my parent container, and every time I use the add method, it adds the object as a child of my scene. All right, so it belongs to my scene in a scene list, almost like a scene graph is what they call it in the book, right? Okay, so I've added in my axis. This is the first object other than my camera. My camera is really the first object that I've added in. That's really an object still, because if you notice, even on the bottom here, right, I need to add my camera to the scene. The one thing I don't do with my camera is I don't use scene.add for my camera. I don't do that. I just create by using the new keyword. Same thing with my renderer. That's the two things I don't really add the scene to. It's part of the scene, but I don't have to use the add method to do that. So axis really is my first. This axis helper is my first object. Then I add in my plane. And again, I need 2 things, my geometry and my material. So there's my geometry and there's my material. And I pass them into the mesh method, the mesh class, and I create a new mesh object, a plane, right? And I turn on receive shadow because I want my plane to receive shadows, right? Okay, cool. And then I rotate my plane and do all that stuff. I change the location and orientation of my plane, right? That's what I'm doing here, right? I'm adding it to the scene. And I'm telling the console that I've added it in, right? Here's my primitive. I do the same thing to the cube. Here's my cube. And it's my geometry is 4 by 4 by 4. What does this mean, right? So if I look at it, it's really width, height, and depth. I'm getting that code hinting right from TypeScript, right? So if I want to make a man, what do I want to do? I want to take cubes and pile them on top of each other. Now, here's a good exercise for you if you can't visualize this, programmatically. Use Blender, right? Make your man in Blender, right? Use Blender units to determine these values, right? And these values, your cube position, X, Y, and Z, right? No.
Yeah.
But it would be, but I'm asking you to do it from scratch, right? So go into Blender, and let's say, for example, I go into my design, and I go into Blender for a second, right? And if I start positioning cubes in Blender, like if I press, Shift D kind of stuff, and I start positioning a cube across the Z-axis here, so I'm just positioning my cube. I'm kind of doing that, and then Shift D across the Z-axis here. I can keep doing that. I can kind of make my man as simple as complex as I want, right? Like, for example, his bottom torso, I could shrink it up a little bit. I could make it so that it's smaller or bigger. I could add arms here. And once I've got that, if I look here in the numeric values here, you can see that I've got locations, and they're in Blender units. It's the same for 3JS. It's just 3JS units. There is no meters or anything like that right now. Don't look at it that way. So if you notice, if I click on each of these objects, I'm going to get a different position, location, and scale, right? So here's my scale, which is 1, and here's my location, which is 2 something. And if I want to make it exact, I'm just going to press 2, right? And the same thing goes for this. I'm going to make this 4, right? So you notice it's like I have my locations, 0, 0, 4, right? 0, 0, 2. Here's the other one, 0, 0, 0. Whoa, right? That's like, those are the values that I'm going to use when I go back to 3JS to program with. Instead of thinking about it in your mind, I can change these values right here, right? So you create your stuff in Blender, visualize it in a tool like that, and then that's the easiest way to do it, I'll be honest with you. It's almost like a cheat way, right? Instead of having to calculate it in your mind. Once you've got your humanoid the way you want them, program them here in 3JS. That's the answer to your assignment number 1, right, at the end of the day. Okay, cool. So you've got this, and then you've got your sphere geometry here. I'm also adding, in this particular example, I'm adding a sphere, and I'm telling that it's very similar to what we did with the cube. Notice that it has my Lambert material. There's different kinds of material. Last time I showed you the basic material, which doesn't take any kind of shadows, whatever. Lambert material, which we're going to cover next chapter. Chapter 3 is Lambert material, right? Which is next week a little bit, right? We talk about here our which is if you notice, it's a little bit different, right? Our sphere is not quite you know, the same color as we had before. If you notice, it's 777FF, so RGB, so more of a bluish sphere, right? Same thing with our cube. It's RGB, so it's a red cube and kind of a bluish sphere, bluish, because it's not quite blue, right? And then here's my sphere's position, exactly in units, if you will. You can use those same units that you get from Blender. Here's my spotlight, and I can make it point exactly at my sphere by positioning it and rotating it. Smart thing to do, go to Blender, add a spotlight, right? Here's, instead of this, change this to a spotlight, right? Here's my spotlight. Instead of it being a point lamp, which is like an ambient lamp in 3JS, you can choose spot, and you can position it so it shines right on your object, right? Notice it also has a rotation. All this stuff you can maintain here with a lot of hard work. Remember that in Blender, it's in degrees, and in 3JS, it's in radians. So you have to make that conversion, but that's not a big deal. What was that?
That doesn't include 1.8.
Correct. Yeah, there's all kinds of, or you can also make this so that in your world, you can choose your world's rotation is in radians instead of angles, and then you're good, right, instead of degrees. Okay, so I mean, again, you could change your scene and prepare your scene in Blender, but programming it in 3JS is the way to go, and it's nice and easy for you guys to do. It's not a big deal. Okay, cool. So you've got this. I've set up my camera, and at the very end, notice that I have my document. I append my object to my document, and then I render the scene. Okay, so this is very similar, and the only changes that I make from one to the other, let's show you the second one before we go. So I'm going to go to one more. I'm not going to deploy it to Azure because there's no time, because we ran out of time. But if I go to my part 3, right, and if there's a bunch of parts up there, and I've even put part lesson 2, part 1, 2, 3, which I'm going to cover a little bit in the first day when we get together again next week. We'll cover lesson 2, and then we'll go into lesson 3. So if you notice that in part 3, we have more. But let's pull up part 5 again, because part 5 was the one that I showed you last time, right? Because that's the kind of the completed example, right? So let's go into part 5. And if I pull that in, here's part 5. And if I was to run that locally, so I want to reveal in Finder, and I double click on my index.html, it looks like this now with this cube, with the sphere bouncing, right? Well, the only difference that I've got going on here, like I said, if you look at my code, it's all the same. But as we get closer to the bottom, I have a couple things. I have a GUI control that I put in place. This is the DAT GUI library that I use. I use my stats object, which is new. And instead of rendering my window right away, I go to a game loop. And my game loop is the way I can do animations, because this game loop fires 60 frames per second by default, pretty much, or as fast as it can render. All right? So this game loop is where everything happens, where I set my cube rotation and my sphere's position and all that kind of stuff. And it's a self-executing function. Notice that I use my request animation frame to call the game loop itself from within itself, which is a recursive function. It's recursive. So I never have to loop this. It's an endless loop. It'll only stop when you stop your program, right? So this is the first time, if you've never seen recursion before, I mean, all you're doing is you're calling it from within itself, and you're going to call it forever. Okay? Questions before we go for the day, right? Please take a look at the material that I provided for you. I'm going to put up additional PowerPoints by the end of the day for part 2, and then you're going to have everything you need to start you going for your assignment. So please start early. Thank you very much. See you next week. Remember, test. You can start with that too. I'm just giving you other options.